Hi there, I'm Darrell and welcome to another one of our webinars. And this one is themed around helping ourselves recharge our own personal battery packs. And what we mean by that clearly, and you probably worked it out for yourself, is it's what goes on between our ears. And I'm going to be honest, I'm feeling a bit smug with myself because as I was thinking of pulling this thing together, I came up with an acronym. Now, alongside the sort of idea of battery packs, and I was thinking of cars and mechanics and stuff, I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could come up with an acronym that actually related to that? But I couldn't. But I have come up with one which has nothing to do with cars, but it is another vehicle, and it's called RAFT. So this is the acronym for this webinar. And it started because I actually, a picture came up on my mobile phone, like one of those memory photos from many years ago. And it was a picture of an old car of mine that I had that I'm not very mechanical, not practical at all whatsoever. So I just ran this thing into the ground. I didn't get it looked after. I didn't get it sort of serviced on a regular basis. It started to get problems in the winter of not starting properly. And then that would sort of bleed into the spring and then the summer. And then eventually it was that classic thing where I finally took it to a mechanic and he opened up the bonnet, just sort of sat there, kicked the tires and just went, this is going to cost you. And I needed a new battery. And because I let the battery sort of essentially fall over, then there were other problems sort of eked around the car. So essentially it wasn't worth actually fixing the car. It was just better off getting rid of it. But the thing is about our own personal battery packs is the fact that actually typically we don't look after our brains and our thinking as often as we could. And it's not quite as simple, even if we could afford it, to go along to some brain mechanic and ask for a new one, because that's not going to happen. So we sort of theme this around 4 things that make the acronym up. So the first one is R. And I have an object from my bookcase behind me. One second. And this is a mirror, clearly. And this is about reflection. So one of the biggest things we don't do in the busy lives we lead is take time to stop and essentially properly look at ourselves in the mirror and work out where we are on our sort of resilience and well-being journey. We're just very good at going and going and going and going and going. And I've been doing a question with people since January of 2021. And what comes up a lot is actually in this pandemic that we've been living in for the last couple of years, we've been reflecting about ourselves in a bit of a different way. Certainly in 2020 and early 2021, things seem to be getting back to a new form of whatever it's going to get back to, and people are getting busier and busier and busier again. But actually in that period of time where we went through a big massive thing that none of us wanted to go through, actually I asked this question, what are you most proud of about you in the last couple of years? And sometimes sort of specific things come back. So people, maybe have changed jobs or have still, driven themselves on to get an extra qualification or achieved a big goal that they've sort of set themselves. So the pandemic didn't hold them back. But actually what comes back a lot is people talk about how surprised they were about how adaptable and flexible and how much resilience they actually have. And I think we've all realized that because if we think about, March, April, May 2020, the world massively changed. But we changed with it, and actually we all changed in a big way. And I'm going to put my mirror down now. It's quite heavy. And so, but I think the reason why we realized how adaptable and flexible we were back then was because we didn't have time to think. So typically what happens is when the world changes on the outside, and clearly a pandemic is a big massive thing, but outside of a pandemic, change is this ubiquitous thing that we're facing all of the time, but we don't remind ourselves of how much we adapt and change. We just move on and move on and move on. And while we're moving on, it means actually it's not landing. We're not actually reminding ourselves of how resilient we actually are. And the problem is because we do have too much time to think. So mine was a ridiculous one really compared to lots of other people, but if someone would have said to me in December 2019, so I've been doing this 11 years now without a brill. So before the pandemic, I was traveling up and down the country, meeting lovely people like you actually in a room. But if someone would have said to me in December 2019, you know what, Darrell, we're going to change the way you deliver your training sessions. We'll give you 4 months notice just so you can get your head around it. But come April 2020, rather than travel up and down the country, what you're going to do is you're going to stand up in your lounge with your laptop on top of a cardboard box on top of an ironing board. That is my setup. And you are going to stare at a webcam and possibly see no one's faces for maybe 2 years. If I would have 4 months to think about that, my brain would have dragged me kicking and screaming and coming up with all the reasons in the world why it wasn't going to work. I'm technically inept. This is never going to happen. Right? It's all over. I need a new career. But in March, April 2020, I didn't have time to think for 4 months. It was time to do. And so actually, what we need to do more often is to stop and step off our treadmill and remind ourselves of how adaptable and flexible we are. And a bit later, I'll explain why that's really important, because we're all doing it. We're all adapting and changing on a regular basis, but we're just doing it. We're not actually living it. So part in terms of recharging our battery packs is to remind ourselves of how adaptable and flexible we actually are. So art, reflect, the mirror is stage 1 of recharging our battery pack. So next up, on the acronym, which I'm very proud of, after R for raft is clearly A, which stands for appreciation. And for that, I have another object to share with you from my shelf. And this is a very personal object. And in this photo frame is a picture. And it was a picture that was taken just over 15 years ago when we moved into the house that we just moved into. And it's a picture of my two sons. The youngest one is Rowan, the eldest one is Ethan. And yes, if you worked it all out, essentially we moved house while we were having Rowan. The joys of having a baby and also moving house at the same time, not stressful at all. However, this picture represented something. This was about a moment of gratitude, because in this moment, when I look at this picture, and certainly in the times when we first moved into the house, you know, we had the same pressures and stresses as any other sort of young family, with mortgages to pay, you know, bills to pay, financial struggles, all that sort of stuff, you know, loads of stuff doing with the house. So all that stuff existed, but actually this picture was about us being grateful for having 2 healthy young lads, and having a nice house for them to grow up in. And I shall pop the picture down because it's quite heavy. So it was about gratitude. But the thing is about that picture is eventually over time, it blended into the background. So essentially it was on a bookcase in my lounge. And I used to look at it when we first put that picture on the bookcase. And I used to look at it every day. So with all the trials and tribulations and the tiredness and stress that we were all going through in normal sort of family life, that was just helping my brain put things into perspective in terms of what I'm grateful for. But what happened is over a period of time, I looked at that picture less, or it felt like that picture had less resonance. It didn't seem to mean as much as it did on day one. And there's a reason for that, because in our brains, there's a thing called habituation. So we might get something new, we might buy something new and shiny, and it feels really, really sort of exciting for a week, and then all of a sudden it sort of, you know, blends back into the stuff we've already got. And it was the same with that sort of picture, that actually it seemed to become less special. It becomes wallpaper. And so it's about us trying to reconnect with this stuff. So there's hundreds of pieces of research in psychology that highlight how powerful gratitude is for our resilience and our well-being in helping us deal with the world. In terms of tools in the well-being toolbox, if you were a mechanic looking after your battery pack, gratitude is one of the biggest ones that we need to tap into. So the thing about gratitude is we have moments of it, and those moments can be quite powerful, but we don't practice it anywhere near enough. And there's a lovely piece of research that was done, quite a famous piece of research that was done, called the Gratitude Letter. And what it did is it got loads of people and put into 2 groups. And both groups were asked to write a letter of gratitude to someone they care about in their life. So family member, friend, whatever it happens to be, but just a letter explaining why they're really grateful that person exists in their world and the difference that person makes for them. And what they did is they measured their well-being scores before writing the letter and their well-being scores after. And of course, across both groups, all their wellbeing scores went through the roof. So yes, it's sort of almost like a one-off process really, but the point being was their own personal well-being, how they felt about themselves, how they felt about the world around them, actually seemed to be much more powerful than the nitty-gritty of getting bogged down in our day-to-day stuff. And then the kicker was that one of the groups was then asked to actually deliver the letter to the person. So group 1 didn't deliver the letter, but they still got a lift. Group 2 ended up delivering the letter, and their wellbeing scores were sort of marked again, and clearly they went to another level. And this is about us doing this within our lives a little bit more. And something I was reminded of, actually, when my lads were a bit older than the picture I showed you, we ended up creating this thing based on the gratitude letter, but we did it if we were sat at the dinner table together, and we'd called it superstar dinners. So what would happen is every single person would have to go round and explain why every other person at that table was a superstar. So I think mum's a superstar because X, Y, and Z. I think dad's a superstar because of X, Y, and Z. And so we sort of did that over a period of time. In all honesty, we did it a bit too much. So again, that habituation thing kicks in. The more you do it, the less special it becomes. So I am going to be honest, it did get to a point where we would all be sat at the dinner table, and then we would all be very suspiciously looking at every single one of us and actually thinking to ourselves, no one start the superstar dinner thing. I can't be bothered to do it today. So the reality is it had worked, but it had lost its magic. So it was time to do something else. So superstar dinners is a nice one, especially with sort of young little family, but actually gratitude's the most important thing. However we practice that, it's not about looking at the world through rose-tinted glasses. There's plenty of things that frustrate me and wind me up in this world, of course there are, but it's about putting things into perspective. And the only way we do that, as in this feeds into reflecting, because this is a reflection, is if we make time to stop and look in the mirror and think about what we've got going on in the world. And I ended up doing my a master's in this field of positive psychology many years ago, and one of my lecturers, who Itai, was lovely, brilliant, fantastic, really heavily in for lots of mindfulness based stuff, but his website, which just really resonated with me at the time, was called Awareness is Freedom. And that fundamentally is the case. Once we are aware of where we are, when we regularly start looking in the mirror, that means we're capable of changing and shifting. But because, unfortunately, we have a negative bias, which is what we're going to come on to in a minute, then unfortunately what we don't do is stop and think about where we are. We just get bogged down and get the blinkers on, and we crack on day in, day out, day in, day out. So A is appreciation for the things we have, not the things we wish we had. We all would like more stuff, but it's about, from a psychological perspective, us putting things into perspective. So after A obviously becomes F, and I've got yet another object. It is another personal object, but not quite as emotional as the photo frame. This is one of my running shoes. As you can tell, I've had this for about 3 years. It looks in quite good state, doesn't it? It's because I don't use it often enough. Anyway, this is all about putting different footprints down in our brain, that is, in terms of helping ourselves recharge our battery packs. In fact, it's the key to everything. So, when I studied my master's, I used to do lectures on a Friday evening and all day Saturday. I'd sort of go down to London to sort of study my master's. And I'm going to be honest, myself and academia don't mix. And you'll know that, you know, those of you that know us quite well know the fact that, yes, while all of our stuff is grounded in lots of academia, the reality is we get rid of the big, long, complicated words. Because as far as I was concerned, I was reading big, long, complicated, long word journals about how I'm supposed to be happy. But actually, there was this lovely sentence that I read in my first couple of months in this academic journal. And what was nice about it, there were no long, complicated academic words. All it did was very simply spell out how you need to think about your brain. And all it said was this: your brain is just like a young child that never grows up. So if we take that as a premise, that no matter how old we get, our brain remains like this young child that never grows up, the logical next question we have to ask ourselves is, so how much care, effort, attention and nurturing are we putting into it on a day-to-day basis? And the reality is, we're all doing the bare minimum. And this negative bias that we've got in our brain. So it's an inbuilt evolutionary thing that human beings have had for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. And in psychology, it's called the Lasada line. So Lasada was the researcher, but essentially it's the ratio of positive to negative for our personal well-being. And because it is an academic piece of work, it has to be to 4 decimal places. So it's 2.9013 to 1. In the real world, it's 3 to 1. So for our personal well-being, we have to recharge our battery packs on a regular basis. We have to think, remind ourselves, or experience and feel 3 positives to every negative. So unconsciously, negativity in terms of thinking is at least 3 times more powerful than positivity. And this professor I met on my master's, he described it around neurology. And I'm sure you're all aware of neurology, and we're all aware of it now. I mean, it was only a few decades ago, we were told by eminent scientists, well, in terms of mindset-wise, your brain evolves till about the age of 12, and then that's it, you are fixed. Leopard can no longer change its spots, this is you. And clearly we now know that's nonsense. We've got neuroplasticity. Our brain is continually evolving and shaping. It can't not. So it's about the control we put into that evolution and that shape. And this professor talked about neurology like footprints in the snow. So we're continually treading stuff down in our brain all the time. Any thought we have is a footprint. We can't not put footprints down, but because we've got this negative bias from a really young age, unconsciously, our brains just drift off in that direction. So we have to consciously, if you like, put different footprints in the snow down. So all of the exercises that you'll hear about, in our previous webinars and future webinars, essentially all this stuff that we share with people are footprints. But the more we put those footprints down, the more we build resilience and well-being. So that's why this stuff works. So, not that it works like this in your brain, but if one half of your brain is positive and one's negative, the negative side is armed, it's charged. There's loads of footprints on that side. What we've not got is enough footprints on the other side. So, exercises around gratitude, appreciation. The more we do it, the more we're putting that footprint down, the more it becomes important in our brain. That whole thing of reminding yourself how adaptable and flexible you are. So the reality is we are all continually adaptable and flexible. We are all showing daily resilience to deal with the world. But because we don't tell ourselves it, because we're not looking in the mirror and reminding ourselves of it, it's not a footprint. It doesn't get bedded down. We're just doing it and not getting the benefit from it. So footprints. And one thing you can do, and this is about, our mental wealth. So it's about improving our mental wealth. The one thing you can do is actually think about yourself differently. So I often do exercises with people in sessions, virtually or otherwise, asking, who are you at your best? So, just come up with a number of words that describe you at your best. And it's really interesting. Certainly when people have to talk about it out loud, even though they might be on a table full of people that they know and they're quite close to, actually people out loud talking about who they're at their best, people feel quite reticent to do that because it feels like we're showing off or we've got a big head. And that research, because it is based on research, is not what that's about. That research is based on the principle of you get what you focus on. So the more you focus and think in a particular way, the more you see evidence around you that you're right. So for thousands of years, us as human beings have been creating our own echo chambers. So our brains help us see the world how our brains think we want to see the world. But because we've got this negative bias, it's dead easy to let in all the rubbish stuff. So your brain's a big spam filter, essentially. But because we've got the negative settings, what we're seeing is something different. So thinking about who you are at your best or talking about it out loud for a lot of people is really uncomfortable. But if I ask the question, who are you at your worst? Well, we'll tell total strangers that. Right? We're quite proud of that. Well, I'm rubbish at that. I'm awful at that. I'm not very good at that. That may well all be true, but we don't need to keep telling ourselves it, because if we keep telling ourselves it, guess what we're very good at spotting every day? When we didn't do that thing quite as well as we thought we were going to do, that mistake we made. We're human beings, we make mistakes all the time. So all of this stuff like we ruminate on. And I sort of believe this, unless you're having a really bad day, everybody pitches in at their best more than they pitch in at their worst. The problem is we don't tell ourselves, so we don't see it. So actually, as a footprint, you at your best, and so I'm going to give you that as a bit of, a bit of homework, is to go away and actually write down all the words that describe you at your best. And then what starts to happen is that's a footprint that gets embedded down in your brain, and then you start spotting the moments more often when you were at your best, rather than dwelling on the moments where we slightly made a mistake and suddenly it feels like it's the end of the world, and it's not the end of the world. It's the way our negative brain has gone on that journey. So footprints. The more we consciously tap in to this mechanical well-being toolbox to recharge our battery packs, the more it works, because we're overcoming our 3-to-1 bias. So finally, the last letter of my acronym, which I'm going to be honest, I'm slightly less proud of now than at the beginning. It's worn a bit thin on me as well, so heaven knows what it's like for you, but it's T. And T stands for time. And that's clearly a watch. And this is the biggest thing really, because in terms of recharging our battery pack, yes, it's all fine and well, you having come to this webinar and very patiently sat there and indulged me with my silly acronym. But actually, well, good for you, Darrell. I'm glad you wear a happy t-shirt and you've been doing this for 11 years. I can tell you, prior to 11 years ago, I was not a happy person. Prior to 11 years ago, I was an extremely busy person, getting very stressed over silly, stupid little things. So from a mindset perspective, I've been there, I've done that. And clearly, I'm normal. Just, you can't choose to be happy because happiness is an emotion, but actually we can help ourselves and help our brains open up to experience this emotion on a more regular basis than it otherwise would do, thanks to this negative bias that we've got. But finding a bit of time is really important. So I know we're all running around like headless chickens, and the world in this pandemic has adapted and shifted, but the reality is now so have organisations and businesses. So what typically happens is with a new way of working, which might have actually taken away a little bit of business, certainly in the first parts of COVID, and if you were working from home, maybe slightly less meetings. But now I meet loads and loads of people who actually are having more and more meetings than they did prior to COVID. And the downside is they don't even have 2 minutes between a meeting to actually have a bit of a chinwag with a colleague, or just have a bit of a laugh, or just have a quick chat about how people's weekends were. What they're doing is they're diving off of Teams at 12 o'clock and jumping on another one straight away. And so we're creating a new busy world. And essentially what's happened is, on a psychological level, we've trained our brains to be busy. So our brains are very good at finding things for us to do rather than doing nothing. And it is a normal human condition for us to do and think nothing. It just doesn't feel like that anymore, because actually we're continually on this treadmill, and our brains now are continually on the lookout for things to do. So, even if you do have a couple of minutes sort of spare, what's really easy is to fill that with doing something. And so for example, these things, the mobile phone. Right, I know they are a necessary thing, and I'm not saying in terms of communication, go back to carrier pigeons, that is going to set us back. But actually research came out of Birmingham around 3 years ago, and I've not seen it updated since, but I'd imagine the number is even higher now, that talked about the amount of interactions we have with our mobile devices on average per day. So every time you pick it up, that's one interaction. Every time you touch it, that's another one. And then you just count them up. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 2,500 times a day on average doing stuff. Now, I know within that 2,500 times a day, you are aware of using your phone. You might phone up a family member or a friend for a bit of a chat. You might check your email if you're not at your screen. But the reality is, for the majority of the 2,500 times a day, all we're doing is picking up our phone for the sake of picking up our phone, because it's just easier for our brains to do something than stop and do nothing. And I often ask the question in my training sessions, who still daydreams? And it's really sort of interesting. I've sort of been asking people that question. It's not scientific, but it's sort of anecdotal in terms of my own little mini research. And actually, as the years go by, less and less hands go up. So it becomes even more of a minority of people who daydream. And daydream is a really important thing. So we all know about mindfulness stuff now, and some of you may well be practicing mindfulness stuff, and I'm not heavily into sort of mindfulness practice. In its strictest definition, daydreaming isn't mindfulness, but it's a pretty close cousin. And essentially, when we're daydreaming, we are thinking about nothing. We are absolutely psychologically recharging our batteries. Even, you can't daydream all day. We've got to get stuff done. There's plenty of busyness that we've got to crack on with, but actually just finding those moments for 2-3 minutes in a day to stop and stare out a window is a really important thing, because it's helping our brain switch off, and we don't switch off enough. So my challenge for you is to think about, if you like, all those little bits of busyness that you don't need to muck around with anymore. So work, if you work will play an enormous part of all of that. I get that, and we've got to deal with all of this. If you've got young kids, you've got family pressure, all this stuff is out there. But actually, if you're finding it really difficult to stop, then actually it's even more important now, right, to actually start training our brains that stopping is normal. So time is the key to everything. Just finding little moments in the day, because what we're genuinely doing on a much deeper level is telling our brain that running around like a headless chicken is not normal, because it's not normal and it's not sustainable, right? We're busy enough as it is. We don't need to make ourselves and our brains look for even more stuff to do. So time is your final one for the RAFT acronym. So then, RAFT, on this scrappy bit of paper with my very uncreative way of writing the word raft, which clearly shows you maybe I wasn't quite as proud of it, because maybe I'd have put a bit more effort into it. But R for reflect, right? We need to stop and actually look in a mirror and remind ourselves of who we are and where we are in that moment, and then we have the ability to change. Helping us change and helping our mindset is A, appreciation, being grateful and practicing gratitude on a much more regular basis. F for footprints, and gratitude is one of those. So we have to consciously start putting different footprints down. We have to tap into our mechanical well-being toolbox to make sure we are psychologically recharging our own inner battery pack. And clearly T is one of the biggest ones around that, because if we don't find time to practice gratitude, to think about who you are at your best, then nothing changes and nothing happens. And so one final item I want to share with you is a passage from a book, and I'm just going to get it now. So this is not one of our books. I recommend our books clearly, but this is a book that I bought 12 years ago, and it's called The Things You Can See Only When You Slow Down, and it's by a Buddhist called Haemin Sunim, and it's a lovely little book to read in terms of essentially how to help ourselves survive in this busy, crazy world. And there's one paragraph which I've reconnected with this year, based on speaking to people and realizing people seem to, in this new world that we're living in, finding new ways of being busy and busy and busy. It's this sentence. We know the world only through the window of our mind. When our mind is noisy, the world is as well. And when our mind is peaceful, the world is too. Knowing our mind is just as important as trying to change the world. And what we tend to do from a psychological basis is we're trying to change all the things out there that we can't control. We don't need to do that. The one thing we can control is how we see the world and how we deal with that world. And that phrase, you get what you focus on, is sort of summed up in there. So when we rest, right, when we have time away from being busy, our mind rests, the world rests, we recharge our batteries. Thank you very much for your time. That seems appropriate to finish on the T of RAFT, but I really appreciate it, and thanks very much for coming along, and I hope you've got something out of the webinar. Take care.